turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, okay, alright. It's about damn time, turn up the music, let's celebrate. I got a feeling I'm gonna be okay, alright. It's about damn time.
Hello my friend, my name is Matt and I make music under the name Best Friends Club, and in this video I'm going to show you how to create a remix of Lizzo's About Damn Time, actually using the original vocal sample from that song. So in this tutorial we're going to be using two specific tools. First is Ableton Live, but you can follow along with just about any DAW. And the second, of course, is LALAL, which we'll be using to extract the vocal from the recording so that we can use it as if it was a stem that was actually sent to us, which is pretty cool. So with that said, before we jump in, if you'd like to try out LALAL for free, you can check out the link in the description below or visit LALAL.AI so you can try all this out for yourself, build out your own remixes, and do any kind of crazy cool things that you extract the stems out of music with LALAL. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to head over to LALAL.AI, and then once you're logged in, you're just going to grab the audio file and drop it right onto this little spot in the middle. And this will automatically start to upload the file that you have, then process it. And then once it's done processing, you'll then be able to preview each of the separated files. So we'll take a quick listen here.
Hey, it might be better, turn up the music.
So that's some of the vocal, which sounds pretty good. And then we can go ahead and listen to the instrumental as well. And they both sound pretty well isolated, and what's nice about having both the vocal and the instrumental is we are going to only be using the vocal, but the instrumental will come in handy when we are warping things later in Ableton. And before jumping back to Ableton, I wanted to give you a quick tip. While things are isolating and doing the magic over here on LALAL, something I'd recommend, particularly when you're doing remixes, is heading over to good old Google and then typing in the name of the song. As you can see, I've typed it before, and then type in the name of the song, the artist, and key in BPM, and it'll either come up in one of the little Google snippet things here, so we can see that the tempo is 109 and the key is A sharp or B flat minor. A nice website is Song BPM or TuneBat. You can check out one of those two in the search results, and this will give you a nice jumping off point when you are warping the track so that you have an idea of what the BPM is, and then two, when you're building all the harmonic content around it, the bass line, the chords, all that, you'll have a good idea of what key the song is in. That'll just make things a lot easier when you're actually building out the track. Alright, so now that we're back in Ableton and we have the vocals separated from the instrumentals, the first thing that I'd recommend doing is dragging the instrumental into a separate track and labeling it vocals or vox or something like that, and then also making sure to also drag in the instrumental and labeling it instrumental and just kind of lining them up. And the reason for that is, as we zoom in here, what we need to do is we need to find the one of the beat before we can fully start warping the vocal track, so that way we can actually build a track around it and change the BPM of the track. If we're just looking at the vocal only to do this, it can get a little confusing and it can be hard to find out where the one is, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by this. So if we play this back,
It might be better, turn up the music.
so we can hear, it might be a little bit hard to tell, maybe you're a music genius and you can instantly figure out where it is, but the one is somewhere in between this kind of white space. It doesn't actually start when the vocal starts. If we were doing this without the instrumental as a guide, it'd be hard to find the one. It can get easily frustrating and kind of slow us down, and when we're making music we want to be doing it as quickly as possible so that we're doing the fun and creative stuff and not getting bogged down by any of this technical stuff. So instead, what I recommend doing is starting by just soloing out the instrumental track, playing it back, and listening for the one on the instrumental track. So let's go ahead and listen for that. So I'm definitely hearing it. It's right about here. So now all we need to do is we can zoom in on this a whole bunch, and we're just looking for where the transient kind of starts, which is just about anywhere here. Should be pretty good, depending on how OCD you want to get, but I'm thinking about right here, so we can go ahead and cut it here for the instrumental, move everything to the left of it, and then we can also cut at the exact same spot on the vocal track since it's aligned. We should be good to go there. We can just zoom out now. We can grab this cut, have it at the start of one of the bars, and if we listen back to it, it should be just about right.
Turn up the music.
Cool. So now the next thing we're going to want to do is actually warp these audio tracks, so that way we can adjust the tempo to anything we'd like instead of having to stick at the actual original tempo of the song. So if I turn on the metronome now, we can hear that it's wildly off.
Turn up the music, turn down.
So if you could hear the metronome in there, it's annoyingly off. So the way to fix this is if you double click on the vocal, what you're going to want to do is move down, click on warp, and then click on warp again, and you'll be able to change the BPM on the bottom left. And since we looked it up, we can actually just type in 109, and then we can go over to the instrumental as well. Turn warp off, turn warp on again, and go over to BPM, press 109. And so now if we play it back with the metronome, let's hear what the result is.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling.
Nice. So now it's all warped up, ready to go. We can change the tempo of the track if we'd like to and all that. And then one other tip on the vocal track as well, if you double click into it, you may want to try changing it to complex mode, and it'll just change the algorithm to be potentially a little bit more pleasing for something like vocal material like this. So now that this is all set up, we can actually build the track around this. And this is where things get a bit more fun and creative. And what we're going to start with is the drums. So let's dive into it. All right, so next let's take a look at the drums. And the reason that I like to start with the drums first is for two main reasons. I want to make sure that the timing and the rhythm of the vocal is working well with the drums, and making sure that the work that we just did preparing the sample did actually work exactly like we wanted to, so everything's in time nicely. And the second reason is that the drums can really have a big impact on the vibe of the track. So by making sure that the vocals are sitting nicely with the type, the style, the genre of drums that you want to do, you can make sure that you are in the right place. And along that same vein, there are two ways that I'd recommend that you kickstart your drums. One, the easiest way would be to simply find a loop in the style of music that you want to work with. Get that loop in here, play it against the vocals to make sure that things are working nicely and things sound good. So we can imagine if this was a loop, we can hear that the tempo sounds nice and the overall rhythm of the drums is working. And so a great way to start that is with a drum loop. And you can always go ahead and replace everything in the drum loop later if you'd like to. But I find if you spend too much time like crafting the perfect kick and the perfect clap and all that stuff too much at the beginning, that, at least personally, I think slows down my creative process. I'd like to get into the more interesting parts later. And then a more advanced method is something that I've kind of been calling loops 2.0. And essentially what it is building out, say like the kick pattern that you want to with MIDI, the clap pattern that you want to with MIDI, the snare pattern with MIDI, hi-hats, all that, then saving it into a group. So then what you can actually do is if you open up the browser and then you go down over into the user library, say under one of these areas here, we can call it templates, you can actually grab this group and then just drop it into this templates area, save it as a classic loop or whatever it is, so that any time that you are working on a track, you can have a couple different variations of these different loops, and you can actually just drag it on to your track, and it'll add this group with all of the routing set up exactly the same, all the effects that you've applied to it, all the samples, all the MIDI patterns, all, as you can see here, just copied right in. And so what's nice about this is that you now have the flexibility of being able to go into the MIDI file here and then adjusting the pattern as you'd like to, but you could also then go into the actual instruments and change out any of the samples. So it's almost like having a loop in the fact that you get that quick ease of access, and you can have it in your project right away, but you also get the flexibility of not only being able to change up the pattern super easily, but also being able to easily change up the samples that are being triggered in your drum loop as well. So highly would recommend looking into something like this. And one of the best ways that you can do this is by recreating a loop that you found or recreating a drum loop that you're hearing in another person's song, starting out from there, and then you can build up your own collection of these loops 2.0 as I've been calling them. All right, so let's quickly look through each one of these drum elements one by one so you have an idea of what's going on. So starting up at the top, we have the kick, which sounds like this. Just your classic 4 on the floor kind of pattern. We'll move on to the claps. So just a couple layers of different clap sounds, as well as like a snare at the end, adding a little bit of vibe. Moving on over to another snare track, which is basically doing a bunch of cool little fills and stuff like that. We got the hi-hat track next, which is just a bunch of layers, mostly doing that off-hat, like kind of sound. And next we got a shaker that I use in almost every track. Some little percussion loop that you're probably barely going to hear. And then a top loop is just basically a snare and a clap, just adding a bit of character. And then lastly, in the second half of the loop, a ride comes in. So for almost all of this, it's pretty basic stuff in terms of, it's mostly like 909 samples in terms of the processing. There's always just usually some kind of low, removing some of the low end, removing some of the high end, sometimes adjusting some of the sustain over here. You can see nothing too crazy. What I do is I also have the reverb on ascend here, and so I'll dial in a bit of reverb from the return. Not doing anything too crazy, usually maybe a little bit of panning, but that's really it when it comes to the drums. So next, let's take a look at the bass line. So when it comes to remixes, the next thing that I would recommend working on is the bass line. And the reason for that is because the bass is usually just playing one note at a time, it's a lot easier to define the harmonic content and then slowly get a little bit more complex as you move on. So what do I mean by that? So if we take a look at this bass line, usually the way that I'll start bass lines is kind of working a couple bars at a time and then slowly expanding outwards. So if we listen to the drums with the bass line, there's the first couple bars. Just have a listen to that. So it's a lot simpler because what you can do, and what I did here was in this MIDI file, I changed the scale to the A sharp B flat minor, exactly like how we found one of the first steps of this whole process, and then just started kind of playing around with the notes. So I'm not crazy into music theory. I don't know too much about that stuff. So I kind of just go by feel and kind of playing around with the notes. In doing so, I've kind of landed on this where instead of starting on the A sharp or B flat minor, I actually ended up deciding that I kind of like the sound of the D sharp being that first note. And if you notice, there's just a little bit of a rhythmic groove kind of playing on that D sharp note, and every note is kind of bouncing around that. It's kind of pedaling on the D sharp. So super simple stuff there, all in that same key, and then kind of bouncing off of these like 16 notes, offbeats, kind of playing around like that, and then slowly expanding it out. So if we listen a little bit further. So it's almost kind of a copy of the first couple bars here. And then we're just with a variation on the second half. And then if we listen to the second half of this bass line here, well, actually, something interesting about this track is that it's in groups of 3 instead of groups of 4. So this is actually the last little half here. So what's happening here is it's kind of the same. I kind of copied over that same rhythm that the notes were playing off of, but then changed. So it moves down to a G sharp, and then it's kind of pedaling around an A sharp. And I just kind of found that by experimenting, by listening to playing back the bass line with the vocals as well as with the instrumental to kind of get an idea of what the original chord progression was. And that's where we landed on here. Additionally, when building up the bass line, so I would recommend starting pedaling on like that first note is a good way to start, and you can kind of build out the additional notes after that is a great way to start. And then also I'd recommend doing everything in context again, so building up the bass line with the vocal. So let's listen to the drums, the bass, and the vocal right now to kind of hear how they're playing off of each other.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, okay, alright. It's about them time.
And that's basically it there. Then taking a look a little bit at the processing here. So I have the bass in a kind of a group here. On the group level, I have a little bit of compression, some tape emulation, kind of gluing everything together a little bit like that. Using this Oxford inflator, which I just got from like a Disclosure live stream and kind of copied the settings. Seems to put that on a lot of bus kind of elements like that. A little bit of EQ, getting rid of some of the lows, and then a limiter just capping off the ceiling a little bit. In terms of the actual sound, I'm using this sub sound. There's 2 layers here. One is a sub sound, which I got from the channel Seed to Stage. It's called Subs You Can Hear. So it's basically just sine wave sub, but then you can increase some saturation and harmonics, so you can hear it on headphones and stuff like that. And then I also have a little bit of side chaining and then a little bit of EQing out of frequency that I wasn't liking. In addition to that, a little trick that I like to do is I'll write the bass part on one MIDI track, and then I will then route that into a second track here. So I have the subs and then I have the mids. The mids has the monitoring set to in, and it's actually, instead of coming from all ends over here, you can see the input's actually coming from the subs. So that means that this MIDI information is automatically routing into this track. So I don't need to duplicate over the MIDI information like that, which makes things just a little easier. So you're kind of just only working with one MIDI track, and this one's just automatically following it. So that way on this mids track, what I have is this bass sound that I like to use. It's like a bass guitar sample that I've gathered. And then cutting out some of the lows on this one, because most of the sub is going to be taking up the lows, cutting off some of the highs, and then quite a bit of sidechain pumping here. And then if you want to hear that by itself here. So it's a cool bass guitar sound. It's a little distorted. I have some distortion coming in and some chorus coming in on the return tracks here. And then all together, you can hear when it sounds fully with the sub aspect and the mid aspect together, which is pretty cool. I like the end result quite a bit. And then this processing that I mentioned at the top is on the group of both of those, and it's kind of just gluing everything together and making things nice and tight. So with that said, now we're going to move on to a little bit more complex harmonic content, and we're going to look at kind of the chords and all the melodics that sit over top of everything. Alright, so now when it comes to building up kind of the main harmonic content, all the chords and all that, usually I'm following that same approach where it's slowly making it more and more complex as I go on, and always making sure to listen in context. So if we start off with where we're at now, which is the drums, bass, and vocals, it sounds a little like this.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be.
While we're in this area, might as well take a quick look. The vocals, there's barely anything on it. It gets extracted pretty well, so all I'm doing is just adding a little bit of sidechain pumping during some parts in the song. There's a bit of high filtering, getting rid of some highs. Really all that there is adding in a bit of reverb and delay through some of the sends over here, and that's basically it. So we can move on to the next element. Again, in that essence of simplicity, one of the first things I add on is one of these single note house string sounds. So again, not very harmonically complex, just adding in one note here, and this is what it sounds like when you add that in.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling.
So nothing too crazy there, still kind of tiptoeing into the complexity waters. And then now we're going to move on to something that's a little bit more interesting, is this really cool little flute idea that I added in here.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, okay.
When I'm building out tracks, I'm definitely more of a sample-based producer. I don't really like performing things in as much. I feel like you can get a little bit more character, and you can get that finished sound a lot quicker, in my opinion, when using samples. So what I did here was I just found a cool little flute sound that was similar to the flute in the original track, and then just cut it up and sampled it to give that same little vibe, little fills playing in.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights.
And that's really it. So that's not being played in, it's just sampled in, just happened to find something on Splice that worked well. And then in terms of the processing there, nothing too crazy. Getting rid of some lows like usual, getting rid of some highs like usual, and then some side chaining like usual as well. A bit over here on the sends, a little bit of reverb delay, that kind of thing. Then moving into some of the chords. Again, the idea here for me usually with this kind of production is to find samples for the elements that I want. So now this is a kind of little chord stab that I found just looking up Splice. Now that I know the key, you can go into Splice and actually find stuff in key, and it just makes things a lot easier. So this is one of the first chord elements that were added in.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright.
So it's that little like duh, 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 just like a little stabby, kind of adding some vibe, a little bit of chord complexity. So basically I just looked up the right key in Splice and then played it back in Splice against this to hear that things were working and it was in the right key, and then added it in, cut it up. Then the next thing is having that idea of call and response, which I think is really big in a lot of music. So the idea is That first chord there is the call, and the next chord that's going to be added in here is the response. So let's take a listen to that together.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, alright. It's about that time.
So there it is right there, nothing too crazy. Again, what's happening here is getting rid of some of the lows and some of the highs and some side chaining as well for both of these chord tracks, something that I do almost every time. Then one of the next things I added was I actually took the instrumental bit and threw it in the track here, and then just used Tantra, which is a pretty cool little effects plugin here, and found a nice preset which just adds a little bit of like vibe and character. So I'll play that back for you right now.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights.
It's so subtle that I think I'll probably play this soloed, and this is what it sounds soloed. So pretty cool little vibe there. It's being sidechained quite a bit, and most of the effort is on that kind of filtered, sequenced, tremoloed, pumping sound from the Tantra effect. And then what I did after that was grab this instrumental track, and so in Ableton at least, if you grab the instrumental track and then drag it onto a MIDI track like this, it'll actually convert the audio to MIDI. So what I did is I chose the harmony function because it's mostly the chords that I was trying to grab from that instrumental track, and then added this next element here, which is this chords track. I'll kind of show you what that sounds like. So just a nice little addictive key sound. Is basically a Rhodes sound that I chose. Similar processing as usual, so there's the lows getting cut out and the highs getting cut out and some side chaining. I also added on that same Tantra effect that was on the original instrumental sample and just dialed it back a little bit on the mix side, so it's gluing together in the same style. And then looking at the MIDI here, it wasn't this clean when I built it out, but it was very similar to this, and essentially just cleaned it up a little bit, tried to make it sound a little bit less crazy. If there was any like really weird off notes up top, just got rid of that. And then this was the final result here. So let's go ahead and listen to everything all together with the melodics.
Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, alright. It's about that time. Turn up the music, turn down the lights. I got a feeling I'm gonna be alright, alright. It's about that time.
So it's kind of interesting. I feel like on its own, listening to the melodics, it kind of sounds like weird jumbling, some weird rhythmic stuff, but altogether I think the end result's quite pleasing and sounds pretty sick to me. And there you have it. That's how you can use Ableton Live and LALAL to create an original remix around a vocal sample that you've extracted from the actual original recording, which is super cool. And there's three main things that I want you to take away from this. First is that by using a tool like LALAL, you can get both the vocal track and the instrumental track separated, which can be super helpful when you are warping and preparing the vocal sample for your original remix so that you could build everything else around it. And second is to leverage templates, presets, and loops so that you can work a lot quicker and maybe take things a little bit further with the concept of Loops 2.0 like I mentioned in this video. It just makes things a lot faster and a lot more flexible and gets you to that finish line of a finished track a lot closer. And third is to slowly work up the harmonic content. So starting off by pedaling around that one note that you know is in the key and the scale, and then slowly building it out and adding in more notes and building out chords and all that kind of more complex harmonic content, so that as you're building up your own remix, you're making sure that everything is sounding nice and you're not getting stressed out that things aren't working correctly, and you can slowly move towards that awesome end product like we did in this example. So once again, if you'd like to try out LALAL for free, there will be a link in the description below where you can get a few free minutes to start experimenting with this and building out your own cool remixes and doing anything you'd like to. It's actually a stem splitting technology. You can actually extract things other than the vocals, which is really cool and makes it super powerful. And again, I've been Matt from Best Friends Club. Hopefully you found this useful. Like and subscribe and all that good stuff, and I will see you in the next video, my friend. Have a good one.